The snow was relentless, swirling in great gusts that blurred the horizon and swallowed the landscape in a blanket of white. Rosalinda Valdez's breath came in short, desperate bursts as she staggered through the deepening drifts, her feet sinking with each step. Her body ached, bruised and broken from the brutal throw that had sent her tumbling from the carriage. Her temple burned where it had struck a jagged rock, the coldness of the snow against her skin a cruel reminder of her abandonment. She could no longer feel her legs, and her left arm throbbed with a sharp, pulsating pain, twisted at an odd angle. Every breath felt like a battle, her lungs scraping against the icy air, desperate for warmth she knew wouldn't come. She had been left to die discarded, like waste her existence dismissed by the man she had once trusted. Caspian Holtworth's face flashed in her mind, cold and indifferent. He had told her she had a choice: marry him, be silent, play the perfect bride. But when she had confronted him with proof of his family's corruption, when she had demanded he make things right, the offer had evaporated into thin air. "You know too much, Rosalinda," he had said, his voice flat and emotionless as he watched her struggle for survival. "I gave you a choice. Keep quiet. Marry me. Play your role." He had lied. There had never been a choice. It had all been a game to him, and now she was the pawn discarded on the frozen road, left to freeze and fade away. Her vision blurred as she stumbled, and the world seemed to tilt around her. The cold had stopped hurting a long time ago, her body shutting down in protest. Her limbs were stiff, her fingers and toes no longer responding, numb to the touch. She fought to stay awake, to keep moving, but it was a losing battle. She had no strength left. As her feet sank deeper into the snow, she thought of her family, her mother, her sister Rosa. She had promised to protect them, to care for them, but now here she was, alone and betrayed, with nothing but the cold to keep her company. She wanted to scream, to call out for help, but her throat was raw, and her voice barely rose above a whisper. The wind howled through the trees as if mocking her, and the horizon was a blur of white offering no comfort. There would be no rescue. No one would find her out here. And then, just as she thought she might lose consciousness, she heard it, the faint thudding of hooves against snow-packed earth. She couldn't bring herself to move, too weak, too cold. But the sound grew louder, closer. A rider. Someone was coming. She wanted to call out, but the words died in her throat. The horse drew closer, its hooves crunching through the snow with authority, the rider's shadow looming large against the whiteness. Rosalinda's eyes fluttered, and for a moment she thought she might be imagining it. But then a voice, deep and steady, cut through the storm. "Can you hear me?" The voice called sharp but filled with urgency. She managed to lift her head, the movement sending a stab of pain through her neck. Through the haze of snow, she saw him, a tall, broad figure dismounting from the horse with the grace of someone used to the saddle. His coat was black wool, and his boots were worn but sturdy. He moved toward her, and she felt his hands, strong and warm, touch her face, lifting her slightly from the snow, cradling her broken body with surprising gentleness. "Stay still," he murmured, his voice calm despite the severity of the situation. "I'm going to get you out of here." Rosalinda wanted to speak, to thank him, but her words were lost in the frozen air. All she could manage was a weak shake of her head, her mind struggling to stay with him, to stay alive. But she was fading. His hands moved expertly, checking for injuries, his movements efficient. "You've got a broken arm," he muttered, his breath visible in the cold air, as he knelt beside her, assessing the damage. "Possibly ribs, too. How long have you been out here?" She tried to answer, but only a faint sound escaped her lips. "Not long enough," he said with grim determination. I won't let you die here." His words barely registered, but the urgency in his tone cut through the fog of her pain. She felt herself lifted, her body cradled in his arms like a fragile, precious thing. The ache in her chest flared, but the pain wasn't enough to overpower the warmth of his touch. He was strong, and he was saving her. With surprising strength, he mounted the horse, positioning her carefully in front of him. He wrapped her in his coat, and though her body screamed in protest, she felt the faintest stir of comfort at the closeness. He pressed her gently against his chest, his voice steady as he spoke. "The nearest town is 15 miles. He said, his voice quiet but firm. "Stay with me, all right? I won't let you go." Rosalinda couldn't respond, her eyelids heavy, her body too exhausted to fight. She wanted to tell him thank you, but the words escaped her, slipping through her mind like sand through an hourglass. The rhythm of the horse's movements became a lullaby, and she found herself drifting, her thoughts spinning between memories of Caspian and the cold reality of her situation. His voice, low and insistent, continued to bring her back when she slipped into unconsciousness. "What's your name?" he asked, his words a lifeline pulling her from the edge of sleep. "Rosalinda," she managed, her voice faint but strong with the need to be heard. "Rosalinda," he repeated as if committing the name to memory. "Hold on. You're going to make it." The ride felt like hours, and yet it passed in fragments. She was aware of the horse beneath them, its steady trot carrying them across the snow through the storm to some uncertain future. The cold had long since faded from her limbs, replaced by a strange, numb warmth that made her feel as if she were floating. When she next opened her eyes, it was to warmth. Real warmth. A crackling fire. The scent of something earthy, comforting. She tried to move, but her body screamed in protest, the ache of her broken arm making it impossible. "You're safe now," the man's voice said again, but this time it was softer, more reassuring. Her eyes flickered to him as he sat beside her, watching her with quiet intensity. His face was strong, his features chiseled with a weathered look that suggested experience in hardship. His eyes were dark, filled with an unreadable depth, but there was something about him, something protective. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice cracked and weak. "Ravenfield," he replied. "You're at my ranch, and you're going to be fine." Rosalinda didn't know if she could trust him, but in that moment it didn't matter. She was alive, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she had a chance. As the warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, she closed her eyes, drifting once again, but this time with a single thought in her mind: survival. The battle ahead would be long, but for now she was alive, and that was enough. She had been saved, but she had no idea that the true battle, the one for justice and revenge, had only just begun. The cold was unforgiving, but Antonio's warm coat wrapped around her like a shield, and his deep voice, laced with authority, told her one thing: "You're safe now, and we'll make them pay." Rosalinda's head spun as the world shifted around her. The cold that had been a constant ache receded, replaced by warmth and the soft, rhythmic thumping of a horse's hooves. The world seemed to move in slow motion, each beat of the hooves bringing her closer to something she couldn't quite comprehend. She opened her eyes, blinking against the sudden sharpness of the light. Her vision was still blurred, but she could make out the rough contours of a man's face. His features set in determination, his eyes focused ahead as he held her carefully against his chest. "Stay with me, Rosalinda," he murmured, his voice calm but insistent. The words barely registered in her foggy mind, but the firmness in his tone broke through the haze of pain and confusion. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, her voice nothing more than a croak. All she could do was cling to him as the horse moved steadily through the storm. She had no idea where they were going, but she felt no fear. There was something about the man holding her, something in the steady cadence of his voice that told her she was no longer alone. She closed her eyes again, the effort of staying conscious too much to bear. The rhythmic motion of the horse beneath them, combined with the warmth of the coat wrapped around her shoulders, made it easy to drift in and out of sleep. In these brief moments of clarity, she registered the rawness of the world around her. The biting wind that had once threatened to claim her now seemed distant, replaced by the solid, reassuring presence of the man who had found her. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but in that moment she didn't care. She had been left to die by the one person she had trusted most, Caspian Holtworth, and now in the midst of the storm someone had come to her aid. A stranger, a protector. For the first time since she had been abandoned, she felt as though there might be hope. She didn't remember how long they had been riding when they finally reached their destination, but when the horse slowed to a stop, Rosalinda was barely conscious. She felt herself lifted carefully from the saddle, her broken body jolting with every move. The pain was unbearable, but she didn't have the strength to scream. A new sensation, a softness beneath her, caused her to stir again. She was lying on something warm, something that smelled of firewood and fresh earth. It was different from the cold, suffocating snow. "Easy now," the man's voice said, softer this time. "We're inside." She felt him adjust her, taking her broken arm carefully, and though the pain was sharp, she felt a brief flicker of gratitude that he wasn't rushing her, wasn't treating her like some fragile thing that might break in his hands. He was strong yet gentle, and that combination was a strange comfort. The sound of crackling fire reached her ears, followed by the scent of something earthy and rich. She tried to open her eyes but couldn't. Her body felt like a stranger's, heavy and unresponsive. Her mind, too, seemed far away, like a distant memory she couldn't grasp. "Just rest for now," the man said, his voice close to her ear. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." Rosalinda's eyelids fluttered, and for the first time since she had fallen from the carriage, she felt the relief of not having to fight to stay awake. The warmth of the fire, the comforting weight of blankets covering her, the rhythmic sound of someone moving nearby, it was enough to pull her deeper into a restless sleep. In those fleeting moments, she wondered if this was the end. She had been on the verge of dying, had felt the cold seep into her bones, but now somehow she was alive. When she woke again, she was no longer on the cold ground of the snow-covered forest. The fire crackled nearby, and the warmth of the room enveloped her like a soft cocoon. Her arm was splinted, and though it still throbbed with pain, it was no longer unbearable. The bandage around her head reminded her of the blow she had taken when Caspian had discarded her. The wound on her temple had been stitched, and she could feel the tenderness of her ribs beneath the blankets. Her eyes slowly focused on the figure beside her. He was sitting in a chair, his eyes trained on her, observing quietly. His presence was commanding, yet there was something in his gaze, something unreadable that kept her from feeling afraid. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and her words came out rasping, weak. Where am I, Ravenfield?" He replied, his voice low and steady. "You're at my ranch. You're safe now. Ravenfield." The name echoed in her mind, but she couldn't place it. She tried to sit up, but the effort was too much. Pain shot through her ribs, and she collapsed back onto the bed, gasping for air. "Take it easy," he said, rising from his chair. He moved toward the table by her side, pouring water from a jug into a cup. "You need to rest. You're lucky to be alive." Rosalinda took the cup gratefully, her hands trembling as she sipped the cool water. She couldn't believe she was here in this warm room, safe from the cold and Caspian's cruelty. It all felt surreal. Just hours ago, she had been lying in the snow, certain she was about to die. Now there was hope again, fragile as it might be. I don't understand, she whispered, her mind still foggy from the pain and the exhaustion. Why did you save me? The man who had been silent until now turned toward her, his gaze steady and calm. Because you were in need. Because no one should die alone in the snow. And because I don't believe in letting people like Caspian Holtworth get away with things. Caspian. The name sent a jolt through Rosalinda. She had thought of him as someone who had cared for her, someone who had loved her. But now the memory of his cold indifference, the way he had discarded her like trash, surged within her. He had lied. He had betrayed her. But this man, this stranger, he had seen her in her weakest moment and had chosen to save her. She tried to sit up again more carefully, this time the pain in her body reminding her of her fragility. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse but filled with curiosity. "Why do you care?" "I'm Antonio Ramirez," he said, his voice steady. "I run the ranch here, and I've been at odds with the Holtworth family for a long time. You're not the first to fall victim to their lies." Rosalinda's heart beat faster. The Holtworths. She hesitated, still unsure of how to frame the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "They've done much worse than you know," Antonio continued, his voice colder now. "And they're not going to get away with it, not while I'm still breathing." He turned, walking toward a chest in the corner where he retrieved a worn coat and a thick scarf. When he turned back to face her, his expression softened just enough to give her a glimmer of reassurance. "You're safe for now," he said. "But the fight's far from over. You may be here because I found you, but now we've both got something to fight for." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "We'll make them pay for what they've done to you." His promise hung in the air, charged with a dangerous energy that left Rosalinda feeling both apprehensive and oddly hopeful. There was no going back. She had been saved, but now she had to decide, was she ready to join this stranger's fight? And more importantly, did she have the strength to do it? Her answer wasn't clear yet, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to die in the snow. Not like Caspian had planned. She would survive, and if she had to fight for her life, she would. "Marry me and you'll be untouchable." Antonio's voice was steady, but Rosalinda could hear the hidden urgency beneath the words. The weight of the proposition hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Rosalinda stared at Antonio, unable to process what he had just said. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment her broken body felt like it was no longer hers. Her mind was racing in 1,000 directions, grasping for a response, but everything felt distant. The warmth of the fire crackled in the corner of the room, but the chill had returned to her bones. Her hand trembled slightly where it rested on the blanket, and she clenched her fingers into a fist, trying to ground herself in reality. She had just been on the verge of dying in the snow, and now in the safety of this strange place. This man, Antonio Ramirez, the giant rancher, was offering her a lifeline. But it was more than just a simple rescue. It was a bargain, a deal, a marriage. "Marry you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Why Antonio didn't answer immediately. He stood by the fire, his back to her, looking out the window, his shoulders broad beneath the dark wool of his coat. His silhouette seemed larger than life, a figure carved from the very land that surrounded them. He turned back to her slowly, his expression unreadable. "I've seen what the Holtworths do to people," he said, his voice colder now, more resolved. "I've fought them for years, and they've taken enough from me. You're not the first person they've hurt. But if you want to survive, you need something they can't take away. You need power, protection. You need status." Rosalinda's chest tightened at his words, the truth of them cutting deeper than she expected. She had always been taught to trust in people, to believe that love and loyalty were enough to keep her safe. But Caspian had shattered that illusion when he cast her aside, like an unwanted doll. Antonio continued, his voice softer, but still firm. "Marry me and the Holtworths won't be able to touch you. I can protect you, give you something they can't take away." Rosalinda closed her eyes briefly, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent her whole life learning how to survive, how to protect her family and her future. She had always thought that love would be the thing that kept her safe, that it would be enough to shield her from the harsh world around her. But love had failed her. Caspian's betrayal had made that clear. The thought of marrying Antonio, a man she barely knew, someone whose life and ambitions were bound up in this war with the Holtworths, was daunting. But in the coldest, darkest corner of her mind, something stirred. Could it really be that simple? A marriage for survival, she would no longer be a victim. She would have power. And with that power, maybe she could finally make the Holtworths pay for everything they had taken from her. Her breath hitched in her chest, and for the first time since her near death in the snow, she felt a spark of determination. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a chance to take control of her life again. She would no longer be the woman left to die in the snow. She would fight. She would survive. And she would make them all regret what they had done. Antonio saw the shift in her expression, the way her shoulders straightened, and he knew she was considering it. He stepped forward, his hand extended, palm up, in a silent offering. "I'm not asking for love," he said quietly. "I'm asking for a partnership. A way for both of us to survive. You won't be alone in this, and I'll help you get your justice." Rosalinda met his eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always been taught to be cautious, to guard her heart against betrayal. But she couldn't afford that now. She had been abandoned, once left to die in the snow. She couldn't afford to waste any more time hoping for a different fate. Antonio was offering her a way out, a way to take back the control she had lost. "I'll marry you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But know this, I don't trust you yet. I don't trust anyone. This is a partnership, Antonio. No more, no less." His expression softened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. "I didn't expect anything more from you," he replied. "We'll start with trust, and we'll see where it goes. But we'll do this together." Rosalinda nodded, the gravity of the decision settling over her. She had made her choice. The Holtworths would not win. Not this time. They had taken so much from her, but now she would take something back. Antonio moved to the door, his hand on the handle as he turned to her. "I'll have the arrangements made. We can marry tomorrow. You need to get well, Rosalinda. This fight is only beginning." As the door closed behind him, Rosalinda leaned back against the pillows, her mind racing. The storm outside still raged, but here in this small room, she had found a flicker of light. Her heart was heavy with the weight of what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something akin to hope. She wasn't sure what her life would look like after this marriage. She wasn't sure how she could ever trust again. But one thing was clear, she was no longer a victim, and with Antonio's help, she would bring the Holtworths to their knees. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk, and she would walk it no matter the cost. The vows were spoken in haste, but when Antonio's hand held hers, it felt like the weight of 1,000 storms had finally settled. The air in the small chapel was heavy with the scent of pine and burning candles, the flickering light casting shadows on the stone walls. Rosalinda stood at the altar, her heart pounding in her chest, every breath coming in shallow gasps. Her hand, still tender from where it had been bound in the bandages, rested in Antonio's strong grip. The priest's words seemed distant, muffled by the rush of thoughts that filled her mind. This wasn't the marriage she had dreamed of, no elaborate ceremony, no beautiful promises whispered beneath the stars. It wasn't the union of love and shared futures. It was a contract, a deal forged in the fires of necessity, born of the need to survive. But as Antonio stood beside her, his presence solid and unyielding, Rosalinda felt the weight of something else, something she couldn't quite name. A spark of something that might someday grow or might not. But for now, it was enough to know she wasn't alone. She had agreed to marry him for one simple reason: survival. The Holtworths had left her for dead, and the only way to secure her future. Her family's future was to align herself with someone who had the strength to fight back. Antonio wasn't just a man who had saved her life. He was a giant in the world of ranchers, a man with power and influence. Together they could take down the Holtworths. But as the priest's voice faded and the vows echoed in the quiet chapel, Rosalinda couldn't shake the feeling that this marriage might become more than just a means to an end. "Do you, Antonio Ramirez, take Rosalinda Valdez to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The priest's voice was soft, but firm. Antonio's grip on her hand tightened slightly as he looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. His dark eyes were filled with determination, but there was a flicker of something else in them, something that Rosalinda couldn't quite place. He nodded, his voice strong as he spoke the words that would bind them together. "I do." The room seemed to hold its breath as the priest turned to Rosalinda. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, her chest tightening as her own heart struggled to catch up with the reality of what she had just agreed to. Marrying Antonio wasn't something she had planned, wasn't something she had ever wanted. But the world had left her with no choice. Caspian had turned his back on her, leaving her to die, and now the only way to take back control was to accept this union. "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the finality of it settled in her bones like a stone dropped into a deep well. The priest smiled, a knowing glimmer in his eyes, as he pronounced them husband and wife. Antonio didn't let go of her hand, and for a brief moment, Rosalinda allowed herself to believe that this might not be as bad as she had imagined. There was strength in his presence, in the quiet assurance that radiated from him. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a bond, a promise that they would face what came next together. As the ceremony ended, Antonio led her out of the chapel, his hand still clasped around hers. The cold air hit them both as they stepped outside, but it was a relief after the stifling heat of the chapel. The world beyond the stone walls stretched out before them, the rugged terrain of the ranch and the distant mountains standing like sentinels, silent and watchful. "You're part of this now," Antonio said quietly, his voice deep and rich, carrying a weight of meaning she wasn't sure she fully understood. Rosalinda looked up at him, her mind racing. She was part of this, yes. But what did that truly mean? Part of his fight, part of the ranch. She had no answers, only questions. The future felt like an open field, a place she had no choice but to walk, unsure of the path, but knowing she had to keep moving. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, though inside she felt the tremors of uncertainty. "And I'm ready. For whatever comes next." Antonio nodded, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good," he said. "We need to get to work." The days that followed were a blur of activity. Antonio kept her close, showing her the intricacies of life on the ranch, teaching her how to manage the land, how to handle the workers, how to ensure the Holtworths' influence wouldn't touch them again. Rosalinda quickly learned that her role was more than just standing by his side. She had to be involved every step of the way. She was no longer just a pawn to be protected. She was a player in the game. She worked side by side with Antonio, managing cattle, negotiating with local traders, and planning their next moves. She could see the weight of the Holtworths' looming threat in every decision Antonio made, the way he studied every move, every piece of land, as if calculating a strategy. He was always thinking 3 steps ahead, his mind working in ways she could barely keep up with. But she was learning slowly but surely, and with each passing day, she felt herself growing into this new life, this new role. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the pressure threatened to crush her, when she felt the weight of the choices she had made, the consequences of aligning herself with Antonio. But in those moments, when she would look up and see him standing across the room, his eyes steady and focused, she knew she wasn't alone. He was in this with her, and together they would face whatever the Holtworths threw at them. One night, as they sat by the fire in the small cabin on the ranch, the warmth of the flames flickering between them, Antonio looked at her, his face hard but thoughtful. "We'll need more than just the ranch to take them down," he said, breaking the silence. "We'll need allies, people who have seen the truth about the Holtworths and are willing to stand with us." Rosalinda nodded, understanding. She had seen the ruthlessness of the Holtworths, the way they used their wealth and power to crush anyone who stood in their way. It was clear that taking them down wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be done with just the 2 of them. They needed to build a coalition, a force strong enough to stand against the Holtworths' reach. "We'll find them," she said quietly, the determination in her voice matching his. "We'll find the ones who want to see them fall." Antonio's gaze softened just for a moment, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The warmth of his touch grounded her, gave her the strength to continue. They were in this together, for better or worse. The path ahead was uncertain, but Rosalinda knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back. She had made her choice. And now, with Antonio by her side, she would fight to take back everything the Holtworths had stolen from her. Being the rancher's wife wasn't about gentleness, it was about strength, grit, and the ability to fight for what you believed in. The days had settled into a rhythm, one that was foreign, yet strangely comforting, to Rosalinda. She woke each morning to the sound of the rooster's call, signaling the start of another day on Antonio's ranch. The sun had barely crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, and already there was work to be done. The morning air was crisp, but the promise of a new day filled her with purpose. She stood at the barn, the wooden planks cold beneath her boots, as she watched the workers moving across the property, tending to the cattle and horses, repairing fences, and checking the barns. The sight was familiar in some ways. She had grown up on a ranch after all. But there was a stark difference now. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was part of this world, learning to navigate its intricacies, its demands. And with that came a weight, one she hadn't anticipated, but had quickly come to accept. Her fingers, once soft and delicate, were becoming rougher from the hard work, the calluses forming, as she spent hours learning how to manage the ranch. She moved among the workers, asking questions, observing, offering guidance when needed. She wasn't just Antonio's wife now. She was his partner in every sense of the word. She had been skeptical at first, unsure of how her role would evolve, how much of herself she was willing to give up for survival. But as the days passed, something inside her shifted. She had been forced to adapt, to become more than the victim who had been thrown into the snow. She had chosen this path. And the path she was walking now was not one of submission, but of strength. Antonio had offered her protection, but he had also offered her the chance to take control of her own destiny. Rosalinda Antonio's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him approaching with a purposeful stride. His dark eyes met hers, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips, though there was an edge to his expression. "I need you to come with me." There's something we need to discuss. She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. What's going on? Antonio didn't answer immediately, but gestured for her to follow him as he walked toward the far end of the property. Rosalinda fell into step beside him, the crunch of their boots against the dirt, a steady rhythm in the quiet morning. It's about the Holtworths. Antonio finally said, his voice low, his tone filled with quiet resolve. They've been making moves trying to undermine our position. They're not happy with how things are shaping up around here. Rosalinda's stomach tightened at the mention of the Holtworths. After the confrontation with Caspian and her decision to marry Antonio, she had steeled herself for the inevitable retaliation. But hearing that they were already making moves against them sent a cold wave of dread through her. What do you mean? She asked, her voice sharp with concern. What are they doing? Antonio stopped walking and turned to face her, his gaze steady but intense. They've been buying up land near the northern border, pushing their influence further into the region. They're trying to corner the market, cut off anyone who stands in their way. Rosalinda felt a surge of frustration rise within her. The Holtworths had taken so much from her already, but this was an act of war. They weren't just content with ruining her life. They wanted to control everything, to crush anyone who dared to oppose them. We can't let them do this, she said, her voice firm. We can't let them have the land. We've worked too hard to build something here. Antonio nodded, his expression grim. I know. That's why I need you to help me. We've got to rally the other ranchers, get them on our side. If we don't, the Holtworths will walk all over us. The weight of his words settled heavily on Rosalinda's shoulders. She had been fighting for her survival, for justice for so long, but this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the future of the land she had come to love, the people who depended on it. We'll do it, she said, her voice resolute. We'll stand together, and we'll make sure they know they can't push us around. Antonio gave her a brief, approving nod, and they both turned back toward the ranch house. I'll make the arrangements. We'll need to act quickly. Rosalinda's mind was already racing, strategizing how they could bring the other ranchers into the fold, how they could turn the tide against the Holtworths. She wasn't just going to stand by and watch her life be destroyed by their greed. She had fought for too long, had endured too much to back down now. The next few days were a blur of meetings, letters sent and whispered conversations in the shadows of the ranch house. Rosalinda worked tirelessly, talking to the neighboring ranchers, convincing them that their only chance of survival was to stand together. Antonio's presence was a constant. His quiet confidence and calculated approach inspired trust. But Rosalinda knew it was her words that would sway the others. She had to be the voice that rallied them, the one that made them believe in the possibility of victory. It wasn't easy. There were threats, intimidation tactics used by the Holtworths to try to break their resolve, but every time they pushed, Rosalinda pushed harder. She would not let them destroy everything she had fought for. Not again. Not ever. By the end of the week, she had secured the support of several ranchers, men and women who had long lived under the shadow of the Holtworth Empire. They were tired of being bullied, tired of watching their land and livelihoods being swallowed up by the powerful family. They wanted change. And Rosalinda, alongside Antonio, was going to give it to them. We've got them, Rosalinda said, her voice filled with triumph as she stood in front of the group of ranchers gathered in the barn. The Holtworths will no longer control our future. Together, we're strong enough to take them down. There was a collective murmur of agreement, the energy in the room palpable. Rosalinda looked around at the faces before her, at the men and women who had finally found the courage to stand up. They had all been broken in some way by the Holtworths, but now they were united by a single purpose. Antonio stepped forward, his hand resting on Rosalinda's shoulder, and the room fell silent. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared resolve. "We've made our stand, but the real fight is ahead of us." Rosalinda nodded, feeling the gravity of his words settle within her. The Holtworths had pushed them to the edge, but they were not going to win. Not while she still had breath in her body. The battle was just beginning, and this time the Holtworths would not get away with it. As the meeting came to an end, Rosalinda stepped outside, the cool air biting at her cheeks, but the warmth of determination burned in her chest. She had chosen this fight, and now she was ready to see it through to the end, whatever it took. They think we're weak because they think we're alone, but I'll show them how wrong they are. Antonio said, his voice low, filled with deadly resolve. Rosalinda stood in the center of the room, her breath steady despite the nerves tightening her chest. She glanced at Antonio, whose gaze was fixed on the map spread out on the table in front of them. The Holtworths had made their first move, one that had left a bitter taste in her mouth, but now it was time to return the favor. The news had come quickly. The Holtworths were pushing harder into the region, buying up land near the northern border, as Antonio had predicted. But now they were doing more than just buying land. They were making threats. Intimidation tactics had started. A few stray cattle disappeared from the outskirts of other ranches, a few fences torn down, and more dangerously, anonymous threats had been sent to those who dared to stand with Antonio. The Holtworths were trying to break their resolve before the alliance could gain more strength, but Rosalinda wouldn't let that happen. The fire inside her, the one that had started the day Caspian had abandoned her, was growing stronger with each passing hour. She had found her purpose. She had found her fight. "We can't wait any longer." Antonio continued, his finger tracing the lines on the map with precision. "They're pushing us, testing our strength. We need to make a stand, one that will show them we're not afraid, that we have allies, that we can take them down." He paused and looked up at her, his dark eyes sharp and unyielding. Rosalinda nodded, understanding what he meant. It was time to take action. They couldn't allow the Holtworths to think they could simply walk all over them. "We'll strike at the heart of their operation," Rosalinda said, her voice firm. "We'll make it clear that we're not going to back down. We'll show them that this land is ours just as much as it is theirs." Antonio's eyes softened for a moment, a hint of admiration flickering behind them. He had underestimated her when they first met, and maybe so had she. But in these past weeks she had proven to herself and to him that she was more than just a woman rescued from the snow. She was a force to be reckoned with. "You're right," he agreed. "But it won't be easy. The Holtworths won't just fold because we show them a little resistance. We need to be prepared." The two of them spent the next few days preparing for the confrontation that was sure to come. The ranchers who had rallied to their side had been quietly gathering supplies, ammunition, horses, provisions, and word spread quickly that the time was coming. The Holtworths might have wealth and influence, but they didn't have the unity, the community, the fight that Antonio and Rosalinda had cultivated. Rosalinda moved through the ranch with a new sense of purpose, her every decision deliberate. She checked on the workers, reassured the families who had joined their cause, and made sure everything was in place for what was to come. She wasn't afraid, but the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on her like a storm cloud. She had known this day would come, but the reality of it was different from what she had imagined. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for justice, for the life her family had once had, for the land she had lost, and for the future she was determined to build. The day of the confrontation arrived quietly, the morning fog hanging low over the land. The workers had gathered at the main barn, their faces grim but resolute. Antonio stood at the front, his broad frame silhouetted against the early light. He was ready. Rosalinda stood beside him, her hand clasped firmly in his. "We've spent too long letting them push us around," Antonio said, his voice carrying across the group. "Today we take back what's ours." There was a murmur of agreement, the tension in the air thick with anticipation. Rosalinda could see the resolve in their eyes, a fierceness that mirrored her own. This wasn't just about cattle or land. This was about dignity, about not letting the Holtworths dictate the terms of their lives anymore. They rode out in a tight formation, the wind biting at their faces as they moved across the open plain, heading toward the Holtworths' land. The closer they got, the more Rosalinda's heart pounded in her chest. She was ready for this. She had to be. They were fighting for everything now. As they neared the Holtworths' land, Antonio signaled for the group to stop. They were just on the edge of the border where the Holtworths had set up a series of outposts. Rosalinda could see the faint outlines of the Holtworths' workers in the distance moving about their tasks, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. "Stay close," Antonio ordered quietly, his voice steady despite the storm that was brewing inside him. "We're going to make our move when they least expect it." Rosalinda nodded, her jaw clenched in determination. She could see the edge of the Holtworths' property, now the large ranch house looming in the distance. This was the heart of their operation, and it was time to strike. She could already feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This was no longer just a skirmish. This was the beginning of a war. Antonio gave the signal, and the group began to move forward, riding at a brisk pace toward the edge of the property. They knew that the Holtworths had eyes on every inch of their land, but what they didn't know was that Antonio and Rosalinda had planned carefully. Their alliance had grown stronger, their tactics sharper. They had the element of surprise on their side. As they crossed the border into the Holtworths' land, Rosalinda's heart raced. This was it. The moment that would define everything. She could hear the pounding of hooves behind her, the riders moving with precision, knowing exactly what to do. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the Holtworths would know that soon enough. The first shot rang out in the distance. One of the Holtworths' men had spotted them. It was the signal. And within moments, the ranchers under Antonio and Rosalinda's command were charging, cutting through the thick fog like wolves hunting their prey. Rosalinda could feel the adrenaline surge through her, her grip tightening on the reins as she urged her horse forward. She had been afraid of this moment, the first true confrontation. But now there was no fear. There was only purpose. And as the sounds of chaos erupted around her, Rosalinda realized that this fight was just beginning. The Holtworths had underestimated them, and now they would pay the price. As she rode through the haze of dust and shouting, her eyes fixed on the horizon, Rosalinda knew one thing for sure: this was their moment. The tide was turning, and there was no going back. The war for their land, their future, was on. "The Holtworths didn't just take from my father, they killed him," Rosalinda whispered, the weight of her words crashing down on her. Antonio didn't respond immediately. He had been standing near the window, staring out across the vast expanse of the ranch, his hands clasped behind his back. But at her words, he turned slowly, his face hardening. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly, his voice betraying a hint of disbelief. Rosalinda felt her chest tighten as she met his gaze. The truth had been swirling around her for months now, ever since her father's death had started to make less sense, ever since Caspian had first cast her aside. She had buried it, not wanting to face the reality that her father's death might not have been an accident, might not have been the natural progression of time. But now, with the Holtworths closing in and everything coming to a head, There was no more room for silence. They were responsible for his death. She said, her voice a low, steady whisper, but the words hit her like a sledgehammer. She was telling the truth now, and the weight of it threatened to crush her. They lied to me. Told me he died in a farming accident, but it wasn't true. He had evidence. He had files, things he was going to use to bring the Holtworths down. Antonio's expression softened for a moment, the realization dawning on him. He had known that Rosalinda's father had been part of the old fight between the ranchers and the Holtworths, but he hadn't known the full extent of it. The implication was clear now, however. Her father hadn't just been collateral damage in a larger war for land. The Holtworths had killed him. They had silenced him before he could do any real damage. How did they do it? Antonio asked, his voice filled with a raw intensity that Rosalinda had never heard before. She paused, memories flashing before her eyes, the way her father had worked tirelessly on the ranch, the way he had always been so cautious about whom he trusted. She remembered how late he used to stay up at night, poring over documents, his brow furrowed with worry. He had known something was wrong, and it had cost him everything. "I don't know exactly," she admitted, "but I know he had been working on something, files about the Holtworths' shady deals. I found a few things after his death, things he must have wanted me to find. They were meant to be his leverage against them, but it was too late." Antonio stepped toward her, his eyes narrowing with anger as he placed a hand on her shoulder, offering the comfort of his touch. "They took your father's life and his work," he said softly, "and now we take it back. We use it to finish what he started." Rosalinda nodded, her heart heavy, but her resolve hardening. The Holtworths had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. They had killed her father and destroyed any chance he had of protecting his family and his legacy. Now it was time for them to pay. "Tell me what you found," Antonio urged, his grip tightening on her shoulder. "Everything you've learned. If we can use your father's work, we'll take the Holtworths down once and for all." Rosalinda walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room, her hands trembling as she opened the drawer. She pulled out a set of papers, worn and yellowed with age, and spread them across the surface of the desk. She had kept them hidden for months, terrified of what they might mean, terrified of what they might do to her if she exposed them. But now there was no choice. "These are his journals," she explained, her voice quiet but steady. "And these," she said, pointing to a stack of papers, "are the files he kept hidden. Some of them are about land deals, others are about investments the Holtworths made that I can't even begin to understand. But they're all tied to him. He was getting too close to the truth. They couldn't let him get any further." Antonio leaned over the papers, scanning through them quickly. His brow furrowed as he examined the contents, his face growing darker with every page he turned. "These aren't just random business deals," he said, his voice rising with intensity. "This is illegal. Fraud, money laundering. The Holtworths were using your father to hide their tracks." Rosalinda swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. They couldn't risk him exposing them. He had everything, the land deals, the investments, the connections. He could have taken them down. "Now we'll finish it for him," Antonio said, his voice sharp with determination. "We'll make sure these papers see the light of day. And when we do, they won't have anywhere to run." Rosalinda felt a chill of satisfaction run through her at the thought. She had been carrying this burden for so long, the knowledge of her father's death hanging over her like a dark cloud. But now, with Antonio at her side and the papers in front of her, it felt like she was finally going to get the justice she had been denied. "There's one thing we need to do first," Antonio said, pulling her attention back to the present. "We can't just throw these papers out there and hope for the best. We need to gather more evidence, more allies. We need a plan. Rosalinda nodded, her thoughts racing. She knew Antonio was right. The Holtworths weren't going to go down without a fight. They had money, influence, and power. But they didn't have the truth, and that was something Rosalinda was determined to use against them. "We'll need more than just these papers," she said, her voice growing firmer with each word. "We need to expose them to everyone. We need the press, the law, anyone who will listen. They can't escape this time." Antonio's eyes met hers, and for a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of what was coming settling in. But in that silence, Rosalinda felt something shift inside her, a surge of strength, of purpose. This was no longer just about revenge. This was about justice, about making sure that the Holtworths never hurt anyone again. "We'll do it together," Antonio said, his voice steady, as if he were reading her thoughts. "And when we do, we'll bring this fight to them. They won't know what hit them." The fire in Rosalinda's chest flared as she looked down at the papers spread before her. These were the tools she needed to take down the Holtworths, to avenge her father's death, and to reclaim everything they had stolen. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Antonio, the ranchers, and the truth on her side. And that more than anything gave her the strength to keep fighting. They weren't just taking back land. They were taking back lives. "We don't fight with brute force. We fight with brains and strategy." Antonio's voice was sharp as he outlined their next steps. The map of the Holtworths' holdings lay spread out before them on the wooden table, the lines of ink representing miles of land that once belonged to people like Rosalinda's father, and now were in the iron grip of the Holtworth family. Antonio's fingers traced the edges of the property like a general preparing for battle. Rosalinda stood next to him, her gaze fixed on the map, her mind racing with the strategy they were about to employ. "We need to hit them where it hurts." Antonio continued, his tone low but steady. "The Holtworths are too powerful for us to go head-to-head with them directly. We can't afford to make that mistake." Rosalinda nodded, her eyes scanning the surrounding land. She could almost feel the weight of every inch of it, the history of her family, her father's work, all of it under threat. But as Antonio had said, brute force wouldn't work. If they were going to win, they needed to be smarter than the Holtworths. They needed to outplay them at their own game. Antonio pointed to a cluster of smaller plots on the map near the northern border. "These," he said, his finger hovering over the land, "are key. They may look insignificant, but they're strategically important. If we can take control of them, it will disrupt the Holtworths' plans. They'll be forced to redirect their resources to fight us here, rather than consolidating their hold on the rest of the region." It was a subtle but brilliant move, one that Rosalinda hadn't seen coming. The Holtworths had likely overlooked these smaller plots, thinking they weren't worth the effort. But Antonio's sharp eyes saw them for what they were: small but essential to the bigger picture. Rosalinda leaned in, her fingers tracing the same lines Antonio had pointed out. "How do we gain control of them?" Antonio met her eyes, a determined glint in his gaze. "We need to convince the ranchers in that area to join us. They're isolated, vulnerable, and most importantly, they're tired of being pushed around by the Holtworths. We offer them a better deal, one that includes protection, fair trade, and a future without fear." A knot tightened in Rosalinda's stomach. It wasn't going to be easy. The Holtworths had a long history of intimidation and bribery. Many of the ranchers were too afraid to stand up to them, too afraid of losing their land or their lives. But she knew deep down that Antonio was right. If they could bring these ranchers to their side, the Holtworths would lose their grip on a significant portion of the land they had been trying to control. And if they refuse? Rosalinda asked, her voice steady but laced with caution. Antonio's eyes darkened. Then we make sure they understand that the Holtworths are not the only option. We give them a choice. And if they don't take it, we fight. But we'll fight smart. No wasted blood. The air between them thickened with the weight of what was to come. Rosalinda had never imagined she would be in this position, fighting for land, for justice, for the future of her family. But now that she was here, she felt the fire inside her grow. She wasn't going to let the Holtworths win. Not again. They had already stolen too much. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Antonio led the effort to contact the ranchers in the northern border areas, sending trusted riders with messages of alliance, offering them a chance to join forces. The response was slower than they had hoped, but they were making progress. Slowly, the word spread, and more ranchers began to show interest in the idea of standing against the Holtworths. Rosalinda spent her time organizing the logistics, gathering supplies, preparing for potential conflicts, and meeting with the ranchers who had already pledged their support. She worked closely with Antonio, her mind sharper than it had ever been. This was more than just a fight for survival. This was a chance to reshape the future of the land they lived on, to push back against the corruption that had festered for too long. One afternoon, as they sat in the small cabin on the ranch going over plans for the upcoming meeting with the northern ranchers, Antonio leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Rosalinda. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice low but full of admiration. "When I first found you, you were a woman who had been thrown to the wolves. But now you're not just surviving. You're leading. You're making decisions that are going to change everything." Rosalinda felt a flush of pride rise in her chest, but she quickly pushed it down. This wasn't about pride. This was about the fight ahead, about ensuring the Holtworths were brought to justice. "It's because of you," she said, her voice steady. "You didn't give up on me. You didn't let me stay in that snow broken and lost." Antonio looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter this time. "You didn't give up on yourself. That's what's important." The words settled in her chest like a weight, but it wasn't a heavy burden. It was a reminder that she had come this far, not just because of Antonio, but because she had fought too. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the meeting, going over the details one last time. Antonio's confidence was unwavering, and it steadied Rosalinda's nerves. He had a plan, and for the first time since she had found herself caught in this battle, she felt like they had a real chance to win. The meeting was set for the following day. The ranchers from the northern border had agreed to meet them at a neutral location, an old barn just outside Holtworth territory. It was risky. The Holtworths had eyes everywhere, and they wouldn't hesitate to sabotage the meeting if they caught wind of it. But Antonio was determined. They had no choice but to move forward. As Rosalinda prepared for the meeting the next day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The Holtworths had already lost ground to them, and with every rancher that joined their cause, they grew stronger. But Rosalinda knew it wasn't just about land. It was about their future, the future of the community, and the future of her family. Antonio had said they were going to fight with brains, not brute force. But she could feel the undercurrent of danger beneath everything. The Holtworths would never back down quietly, and when they struck, they would strike hard. But Rosalinda was ready. Whatever came next, she wasn't going to let the Holtworths destroy her family again. The alliance was forming, but the real battle, it was just beginning. "In the shadows, you find the real story," Rosalinda mused, holding up a ledger that contained the key to exposing the Holtworths' fraud. The pages of the ledger were old, their edges curled from years of neglect, But the ink was still legible, each figure and date etched in black, as if daring anyone to notice what lay hidden beneath. Rosalinda studied the lines of numbers, the cryptic notes in the margins, and the occasional scribble that her father had left, as he tried to piece together the puzzle of the Holtworths' empire. Her fingers trembled slightly. As she turned the page, her mind racing with the implications of what she was seeing. It had been weeks since they had made their first move against the Holtworths, and since then the tension had only grown. They had gathered allies, rallied the ranchers, and started taking control of key lands that the Holtworths had once claimed as their own. But Rosalinda knew that their battle would not be won by land alone. They needed the truth. The real truth, the kind that couldn't be ignored, no matter how many resources the Holtworths threw at it. She sat at the small desk in the cabin, the flickering light of the fire casting shadows across the walls, and examined the papers once more. The ledger was filled with names of people her father had once trusted, names of those who had worked with him in the past, and of those who had turned their backs on him. The Holtworths had used lies and deceit to cover their tracks, hiding their fraudulent dealings under layers of false promises and threats. But Rosalinda knew that her father had kept records of everything. And those records, if used right, would bring the Holtworths to their knees. Her thoughts were interrupted as Antonio entered the room, his boots making the floorboards creak beneath him. He moved silently toward her, his face unreadable as he saw the ledger in her hands. "What have you found?" he asked, his voice low but full of quiet urgency. Rosalinda looked up at him, her brow furrowing as she tried to process everything she had just uncovered. "I think this might be it," she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "This ledger, this is the proof we need. These numbers, they don't match up. These transactions, these payments are all going through false accounts. There's a network here, Antonio, and it's connected to the Holtworths' entire operation." Antonio stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the pages she had laid out. He didn't need to understand the specifics of the accounts. He could see the patterns in the ledgers, the ways in which the Holtworths had manipulated the system. He understood the weight of what Rosalinda was saying. This could expose everything he said softly, his voice tinged with both caution and excitement. "But we can't do this alone. We need someone who can take this to the right people, someone who can make sure the truth gets out. We need to go public with this." Rosalinda paused, the enormity of the decision settling over her. She had already come so far facing her father's death, marrying Antonio, leading the ranchers in their fight against the Holtworths. But now the stakes were higher than ever. If they exposed the Holtworths, there was no turning back. They would be marked, their lives at risk. But there was no other choice. "You're right," she said, her voice firm. "We need to get this to the press. But we also need to be careful. The Holtworths will stop at nothing to protect themselves. They'll have their lawyers, their contacts. We can't just send this out and hope for the best. We need to control the narrative." Antonio nodded. "I'll start reaching out to a few people I trust. We'll get this to the right people, but we'll need to be smart about it." Rosalinda set the ledger down and stood up, walking to the window. Outside the ranch stretched for miles, the land dark beneath the stars. She could see the outline of the barn, the silhouette of the workers moving silently in the distance, and beyond that, the Holtworths' land. She could feel the weight of everything she had fought for in those vast, silent fields, the land her father had worked so hard for, the land that now seemed as distant as the dreams she had once held about a quiet, simple life. But that life was gone now. The Holtworths had taken it from her. And now, with Antonio's help, they were going to take it back. She turned back to Antonio, her eyes resolute. "We'll expose them. We'll bring everything they've done to light. We're not backing down." Antonio's eyes met hers, and for a moment they simply stood there, the weight of their shared resolve hanging between them. He nodded once his jaw clenched with determination. No, we won't. The following days were filled with quiet preparation. Antonio reached out to his contacts in the press, while Rosalinda focused on organizing the ranchers and gathering more evidence. She knew that the Holtworths would fight back, that they wouldn't go down without a struggle. But she also knew that this was the only way forward. If they could get the truth to the right people, if they could expose the Holtworths for what they truly were, there would be no more hiding. The night before they were scheduled to send the information to the press, Rosalinda found herself awake pacing the floor of their small cabin. Antonio had already gone to bed, but she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the stakes of what they were about to do. Could they really bring the Holtworths down? Could they make them pay for everything they had done? Rosalinda didn't have the answers, but she knew this was the only chance they had. If they failed, they would be destroyed just as her father had been. She looked down at the ledger one last time, the pages still fresh with the evidence of betrayal and lies. The weight of the decision settled heavily on her, but it wasn't a weight of fear. It was a weight of resolve. She had been given a chance to fight back, to claim justice for her father, for herself, for the land. And she wasn't going to waste it. As dawn broke the next morning, Rosalinda walked into the kitchen where Antonio was already preparing breakfast. She had made her decision. It was time. They would send the information to the press, and they would do whatever it took to ensure the Holtworths paid for their crimes. "We're ready," she said quietly, her voice steady as she looked at Antonio, who met her gaze with the same fierce determination that had carried them this far. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of knowing what was at stake. "We're ready," he said, and with that, they began the final step of their fight, one that would bring the Holtworths' world crashing down, for better or worse. "You can't break me, Caspian," Rosalinda said, standing tall before her former fiancé. "Not anymore." The words echoed in the room, hanging in the air like a challenge, a declaration that had been building inside Rosalinda since the moment Caspian had abandoned her in the snow. Her body stood firm, though her heart hammered in her chest. She was no longer the woman who had loved him blindly, hoping he would change. The past few months had shown her who he truly was, someone willing to throw her aside when she became inconvenient, when she dared to question the family that had controlled her life for so long. Caspian's face twisted into a sneer, his eyes cold and calculating as he stood across from her in the drawing room of Lady Petton's estate. The space around them was filled with the heavy scent of expensive perfume and the muted chatter of guests. But to Rosalinda, it felt as if the room had narrowed, as if only the two of them existed in that moment. His gaze flickered over her, lingering for just a moment, on the strength she had found since their last encounter. "You're a fool, Rosalinda," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You think you can take on the Holtworths. You think I'll let you ruin everything I've built." Rosalinda didn't flinch. Her resolve was stronger than ever. She had known this moment was coming, the moment she would face him and demand justice not just for herself, but for everything he had destroyed. She wasn't the scared, helpless woman she had once been. No longer would she cower in the face of his cruelty. "I'm not trying to ruin you, Caspian. I'm trying to expose the truth. You've lied, cheated, and killed to get what you want. I won't let you do that to any more people." The room seemed to fall away, and for a moment, it was as if they were the only two people in the world. The other guests, Lady Petton included, had become background noise irrelevant to the confrontation unfolding before them. Rosalinda could hear the pounding of her own heart, could feel the weight of the words she had just spoken. Caspian took a step forward, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. You think you can win against me? I have the law, I have money, and I have power. You're nothing. Rosalinda's eyes narrowed as she stood her ground. You may have all of those things, but you don't have the truth, and you don't have me anymore. Her voice was firm, every word a reminder of the woman she had become. The tension between them was palpable, a storm that threatened to break at any moment. But it wasn't the kind of storm that would destroy them both. It was the kind that would finally reveal the lies that had been buried for so long. Rosalinda was ready for this. She had waited for this moment. And now, with the evidence of Caspian's corruption in her hands, she wasn't going to back down. Caspian's eyes flashed with something darker, something that reminded Rosalinda of the man he had once been. She could see the anger building inside him, could almost feel it radiating from him like a physical force. But this time she wasn't afraid. He had no power over her anymore. You're making a mistake, Caspian warned, his voice dangerously low. You've seen what I can do. You've seen how far I'm willing to go. You think you can take me down, but I'll make sure you regret it. Rosalinda stood tall, unflinching. I've already made my choice, Caspian, and I won't regret it. There was a long, heavy silence between them, as if the world had stopped waiting for the next move. The air in the room was thick with unspoken threats, but Rosalinda could feel something shift inside her. She wasn't afraid anymore. This was her fight now. She would see it through to the end, whatever it took. Caspian turned on his heel, his footsteps sharp and deliberate as he walked toward the door. But before he left, he glanced over his shoulder, his face twisted in a sneer. You may have some allies now, Rosalinda, but you'll see. The Holtworths will always come out on top, and you'll be nothing more than a footnote in their story. Rosalinda's lips pressed into a thin line as she watched him leave the door, closing behind him with a soft click. She didn't move at first, the weight of his words lingering in the air. But then she exhaled slowly, her body sinking into the chair beside her. The room had gone quiet once more, and it was only then that she realized how much her hands were trembling. She had faced him, had stood tall in the face of his threats. But it wasn't over. This was just one battle in a war that was far from won. Antonio appeared at her side, his eyes scanning her face, waiting for any sign of how she was feeling. You did well, he said quietly, his voice full of admiration, though Rosalinda could sense the concern in his gaze. I don't know if I feel well. Rosalinda admitted, her voice soft, almost unsure for the first time since they had started this fight. I thought I was ready for this, but facing him, it's harder than I thought. But I can't stop now. I can't let him win. Antonio's hand rested gently on her shoulder. You won't let him win. You've already proven that. She nodded slowly, taking comfort in his presence. The fight was far from over, and Caspian's words had shaken her more than she cared to admit. But Antonio was right. She wasn't the woman she had been when she first met Caspian. She had power now. The truth was on her side, and she had people who believed in her. They stood together in the quiet room for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over them both. There would be no easy victory in this fight. The Holtworths were dangerous, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to hold on to their power. But Rosalinda was done hiding in the shadows. She was ready to expose them for what they truly were. The battle had only just begun, but Rosalinda could feel the shift. She had come too far to turn back now. She had to keep fighting, for her father, for the ranch, and for the future she was determined to build. She straightened her shoulders, squaring with newfound resolve. We move forward, she said, her voice stronger now. We expose them, we take them down. Antonio nodded, his expression fierce with determination. We'll make sure they pay. And with that, they both turned toward the door, ready for whatever came next. The Holtworths had underestimated them, and that mistake would cost them everything. It's not just about surviving anymore, Rosalinda. It's about making them pay for what they did to you and to all of us, Elena said, her eyes burning with determination. The words struck Rosalinda like a lightning bolt, and for the first time since she had joined Antonio in this fight, she realized just how much was at stake. It wasn't just about land or wealth. It wasn't just about taking down the Holtworths. It was personal. It was about the lives they had destroyed, the families they had torn apart. Elena's words echoed in Rosalinda's mind as they sat in the dimly lit room, the flickering fire casting long shadows on the walls. Elena had been by their side since the beginning, a loyal ally who had once worked with the Holtworths before they turned on her. She knew the depths of their cruelty, the lengths they would go to maintain their grip on power. Her betrayal had been a catalyst pushing her to join Antonio and Rosalinda in their struggle. Now, as they prepared to strike at the heart of the Holtworths' operation, Rosalinda understood that Elena's anger was not just for the injustice they had suffered, but for the legacy of lies and manipulation that had festered for far too long. We can't afford to wait any longer. Elena continued, her voice steady, unwavering. They think they can take everything from us, but we have something they'll never have: the truth. And with it we can burn them to the ground. Rosalinda looked at Elena, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The fire in Elena's eyes was contagious, and for the first time in weeks, Rosalinda felt the weight of the battle ahead shift. She had been fighting for survival, for justice, but this was something more. This was about standing up to the people who had shaped her life, who had made her believe that power came from wealth and control. But it didn't. It came from people like her, people who were willing to risk everything for what was right. What's the plan? Rosalinda asked, her voice strong as if the words had gained a weight of their own. Elena leaned forward, her hands clasped together. We have to hit them where they least expect it. The Holtworths think they have the upper hand. They believe that no one can touch them, that their money and influence will protect them. But we know the truth. We know what they've done, and we have the evidence. We go public with it. We use the media to expose them, and we make sure the right people hear the story, people who have the power to tear their empire down. Rosalinda nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. It was the right move. It had to be. The Holtworths could silence their enemies with money and fear, but they couldn't silence the truth. The world needed to know what they had done, and with the evidence they had gathered, they could bring them to their knees. We need to make sure it's foolproof. Antonio said, his voice calm, yet his eyes gleamed with intensity. We've already seen what they're capable of. They'll fight back, and they'll use every trick they know to protect themselves. We have to be ready for anything. Elena's gaze never wavered from Rosalinda. You've already proven you can stand up to them. This is the next step. We need your voice. We need you to be the face of this movement. You're the one who has the most to lose, and you're the one they'll fear most. We need to make sure they understand what's coming for them. Rosalinda felt a weight in her chest, but it wasn't fear. It was resolve. She had spent too long hiding from the truth, from the pain that had shaped her. It was time to stop running. She had made a promise to her father, to her family, and now it was time to fulfill it. I'll do it, she said, her voice unwavering. But we need to make sure we're not just exposing their corruption. We need to take everything from them, every ounce of power they've stolen from the people they've trampled over. We do this right. and we don't stop until they've paid for everything they've done." Antonio smiled, his pride in her evident. "That's the spirit. We fight until the end. Together." With that, the plan was set into motion. The days that followed were a blur of activity. They had already gathered the evidence, the files, the ledgers, the testimonies of those who had witnessed the Holtworths' lies and manipulation. But now it was time to use it. It was time to expose them to the world. Antonio made contact with the journalists they had carefully vetted, ensuring that the story would be told by those who could be trusted. Rosalinda's heart raced with every meeting, every phone call, as they pieced together the narrative that would bring the Holtworths down. She could feel the pressure mounting, but there was no turning back. The fire inside her burned hotter than it ever had before. Then the night came. The night they would send the story to the press. Rosalinda stood in front of the fireplace, the papers in her hand, and felt the weight of it all. It was one thing to fight for survival, but this was a fight for the future. For the land, for the truth, for justice. For everything she had lost. As Antonio entered the room, his expression serious but determined. Rosalinda turned to face him. She could see the question in his eyes, but there was no need to ask. He already knew. "It's time," she said quietly. Antonio nodded, and without another word, they left the cabin together, the night air cold and sharp against their skin. The stars overhead seemed to shine brighter than usual, as if the universe itself was watching, waiting for the moment that would change everything. They rode out to the far edge of the ranch, where the designated messenger would be waiting to take the information to the journalists. Antonio's hand was firm on her shoulder as they rode, the connection between them silent but strong. The weight of the moment settled over Rosalinda, but it wasn't fear that gripped her. It was purpose. They reached the messenger, a young man they had carefully chosen for his discretion and loyalty. He took the papers without a word, nodding his understanding. Then, without hesitation, he turned his horse and rode off into the night, the shadow of the trees swallowing him whole. Rosalinda watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no going back now. The Holtworths had made their move, and now it was their turn. As the first light of dawn began to break, she turned to Antonio, her eyes steely with resolve. "We've done all we can. Now we wait." Antonio's smile was faint, but it held the promise of everything they had worked for. "No, Rosalinda. Now we fight. This isn't just a fight for justice, Rosalinda. It's a fight for survival." Antonio said, his voice low, his tone filled with the weight of what was to come. Rosalinda stared across the table at him, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the map spread before them. The air in the small cabin felt heavier than it had in days, the tension hanging thick between them. They had made their move. The story had gone public, the Holtworths' corruption laid bare for the world to see. But they had been met with nothing but resistance. The Holtworths were too powerful, too entrenched in the region, and they had resources at their disposal that could tear apart everything they had worked for. The first wave of backlash had been swift and brutal. The press had been bombarded with counterclaims and threats, their sources discredited and labeled as unreliable. Antonio had warned her that this would happen, that the Holtworths wouldn't go down without a fight. And now Rosalinda was starting to see just how far they were willing to go to protect themselves. But she wasn't backing down. "Not now, not ever. We've lost control of the narrative," Rosalinda said, her voice hard with frustration. "They're using their money and their influence to turn everything against us. We need to fight back, and we need to do it smart." Antonio nodded, his expression serious. "We will. But we can't do this alone. We need to bring in more allies. If we're going to take them down, we need to outmaneuver them at every turn." The weight of his words settled heavily on Rosalinda. She had known this fight would be difficult, but she hadn't expected it to be quite this complex. The Holtworths were entrenched in every aspect of the community business politics law, and every step they took was being watched, scrutinized. They had made it clear that they wouldn't be toppled without a fight, and now she had to be ready to lead her people into the battle. "Who do we have?" she asked, leaning over the map, her finger tracing the lines of their land, the land they had fought to protect. She could feel the pressure building, but it wasn't fear that gripped her. It was determination. "Who can we trust to stand with us now?" Antonio's eyes flickered with thought as he scanned the map. "We need to rally the rest of the ranchers. The ones who have stayed silent, who have kept their heads down. We need to show them that the Holtworths are a threat to all of us, not just you." Rosalinda's mind raced. She knew that Antonio was right. The Holtworths had used fear and intimidation to maintain their control over the region. The ranchers who had refused to join their cause had done so out of fear of retribution. But now that the truth was out, now that the Holtworths' corruption was exposed, it was time to take the next step. "They'll need more than just words," she said, her voice firm. "They need to see that we're winning, that we have the upper hand." "We'll show them," Antonio said. "But we have to be careful. The Holtworths will retaliate. We need to move cautiously, stay ahead of them." The strategy was clear, but the execution was where things got tricky. They needed to gather enough support to stand against the Holtworths, but they also needed to make sure they weren't stepping into a trap. Rosalinda could feel the pressure mounting the weight of everything that was on her shoulders, but she knew there was no turning back. She had already made her choice. This was her fight now. "Let's start with the closest ranchers," Antonio suggested, his voice steady. "The ones who we know are already feeling the pressure. They'll be the most willing to join us. Once we have them on our side, we can spread the word." Rosalinda nodded, her mind already planning the next steps. They needed to move quickly. The Holtworths would be watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. But they also had something the Holtworths didn't: unity. They had a cause, a reason to fight, and Rosalinda was determined to lead them through this. As the days passed, Rosalinda and Antonio worked tirelessly, meeting with ranchers, securing alliances, and making sure they had the support they needed to confront the Holtworths head-on. The more they worked, the more Rosalinda realized how deep the Holtworths' grip on the region went. They had allies everywhere, people who were afraid to speak out, afraid to lose what little they had. But the more they pushed, the more they gained. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. They secured a few key allies, ranchers who had once been neutral or too afraid to take a stand. The fear was still there, but so was the fire that Rosalinda had ignited in their hearts. They saw the truth now. They saw what the Holtworths were capable of, and they were ready to fight. "We're getting there," Antonio said one evening as they sat together in the cabin, the weight of their progress settling in. "We're closer than we've ever been. But we need to keep pushing." Rosalinda leaned back in her chair, her mind whirling with thoughts of the future. They had made significant progress, but the battle was far from over. They still had to deal with the fallout from the press backlash, the Holtworths' continued threats, and the challenge of keeping their alliance strong. The work was never-ending, but for the first time in a long while, Rosalinda felt like they were moving in the right direction. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "We need to take the next step. We can't wait for them to make their move. We make ours." Antonio smiled, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "I knew you'd say that. We're in this together. And we're going to win." Rosalinda stood up, her resolve solidifying. She had come so far, lost so much, but now with the ranchers at her back and Antonio by her side, she had a chance to take it all back. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready. She had a cause. She had a purpose. and this time she wouldn't back down. The Holtworths had underestimated them, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. Rosalinda was ready to fight for her family, her land, and everything that mattered. And this time, they would win. The educational lesson learned from this story is that resilience and courage are powerful forces that can help us overcome even the most difficult challenges. No matter the obstacles we face, standing up for what's right and staying true to our values can bring about real change. It also reminds us that we are never truly alone in our struggles. There are always others who share our fight and are willing to stand by us. Finally, it teaches us that justice, though hard won, is a cause worth pursuing no matter the cost.